Good morning from the venue of the Chess.com Isle of Man International Tournament. My round 5 game of the day features two very exciting players. We have with the white pieces Richard Rapport from Hungary, 22 years old, and really one of the most creative players on the international chess scene. And he was playing against Jeffrey Xiong, who's 17, he's about to turn 18, from the United States. A really exciting prospect for the future, but already rated 2656. He's having a good tournament here, and you might have seen I featured him in an earlier game of the day. Very strong player. So let's see what happened. d4 from Rapport, and already he goes his own way in the opening, playing c3. So he's basically just saying to Jeffrey, okay, you can forget all your preparation. We're just playing chess now. Of course, c3 can transpose into many different and known systems. So let's see where we're going with this one. And actually, so far, it's pretty regular. h6, good idea. Put the question to the bishop. Of course, won't take at the moment, but always nice to have the option, perhaps, of playing g5. And here, bishop e3. Bishop e7 would lead to a fairly standard position. White will play bishop d3 and maybe knight e5. But Xiong played b6, which, well, should lead to a normal position after bishop b7 and maybe bishop e7, etc. But instead of playing e3, Rapport spotted a very interesting idea. He spent 11 minutes over e4. This is so typical of him. He's sacrificing a pawn right from the word go. Of course, if black wants to, it's possible just to take on e4, but, well, that leads to a slightly worse position for black, typical of kind of French positions, French Rubinstein. But Xiong took up the challenge and played g5. And that means he can take the pawn on e4. Now, how do you take it? Which way? Pawn or knight? If you play knight takes, I think this gives white extra possibilities. Because in this case, the queen's avenue to the king side is much more straightforward. Queen h5 possible in some variations, so I can understand why Xiong played pawn takes pawn instead. But anyway, knight e5. So it's a pure sacrifice or a gambit of a pawn in the opening. What's white got for it? Well, for a start, in taking this pawn, black has had to advance with g5, which of course creates a little target for white. We might be able to play h4 to just kind of open things up there. There are weaknesses around h5. It might even be possible to recover this pawn. And don't forget, this bishop could find its way into the position. And you also have to ask yourself, well, where is black's king going to end up here? So already black is under pressure. And, well, if black is careless, it's possible to lose instantly after knight c6. So, of course, bishop b7. Now, it's quite possible to play h4 straight away, but bishop b5. So already pressure on d7 and on c6. And a6 seeks to alleviate some of that pressure. So looks quite nice, but actually it's not possible to hold that knight on c6. Queen e2 looks good, hitting the e-pawn, and, well, perhaps thinking about castling queenside. Now the knight has to retreat, and bishop d6. I find this a really interesting moment in the game, where white has the option of playing in quite different ways. You could castle kingside, you can castle queenside, you can play h4. I mean, I think this is a very tempting move, because it's not absolutely clear to me how black is going to, for example, bring his king to safety. Obviously, castle's queenside is out of the question because the f-pawn is on prise. Castle kingside certainly doesn't look very attractive, and if the knight is taken on e5, then the e-pawn is going to drop here. Also, h4 looks very attractive to me. It's interesting, Rapport just goes in a very different way. He seems to think about chess in a different way to everyone else. He exchanged off this seemingly very nice piece on e5. Now, if knight takes, then of course the e-pawn will drop and white has a pleasant advantage. So in order to keep that pawn on e4, black has to recapture with the king. Okay, so there's a good reason why he got rid of that nice knight on e5, because black's king obviously displaced. And here again, with that king in the middle, it's tempting to play some other moves. You know, maybe castle's queenside. Bishop e5 is interesting, which will probably force this exchange, and white can get the pawn back very easily. Now maybe he just thought this position was getting a bit too dry and the king could run to safety. I still like the knight on e4 very much, but black has kind of found security there. But Rapport had something else in mind. He castled kingside, and this introduces a new possibility of simply playing f3 to blast open the position, blast open the f-file, and you can see that these pieces are very sensitively placed here. So Xiong's next move was, well, I don't know about forced, but considering that f3 was such a strong threat, then yeah, maybe he had to do something like this. And here again, I find Rapport's next move kind of extraordinary, actually. I thought he could simply play rook e1, and, well, I don't think he wants to go into an endgame. I mean, maybe if he doubled the f-pawns, he could. But, yeah, in some positions it might be nice to take here. And maybe that one's even better, because that still has the possibility open to play f3 to open up the f-file and use that nice rook on f1. But Rapport played f3 straight away. Now, black has to keep the position closed, but he can actually hold on to that e-pawn on e3, so this is a mad situation. And now he took on f4 and g takes f4, so black has a protected passed pawn on e3. But Rapport clearly wanted to go for this in order to attack black's king. He's making sure that the king is still kind of very insecure in the middle of the board before black has managed to connect the rooks. And now queen e1. I mean, this is such an unusual way to play the position. So what he's doing is, obviously the queen is looking in this direction, but it's also covering the b4 square, so that after c4 the knight won't be able to hop into b4, and then the f-pawn will be vulnerable. So this is an incredibly ambitious way to play. Now black could prevent c4 with this, and then, well, we just have such a random position on the board. Very hard to know whether black can control this. It's extremely difficult, and you know, I can imagine the prospect of the king being stuck in the middle like this was simply not very attractive to Xiong. So instead he played, well, another extraordinary move, actually, c5, which kind of opens up the position. And after c4, well, I mean, there are a couple of interesting moves. If knight b4, then queen c3 is still very, very messy. But Xiong sacrificed a piece with pawn takes pawn. And we just have a ludicrous position on the board where black has 3 pawns for the knight, but that knight is an absolutely superb blockader here. So those pawns, I mean, without this blockading knight, those pawns would be terrifying. But here this starts to look very good for white, considering that the king is still in the middle. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I felt this was simply good for white during the game. Anish Giri dropped by our commentary studio, and he also thought that white was, well, in his words, probably completely winning. But things weren't so clear. First of all, queen f5 is a good move. If e5 straight away, then actually the black queen is somehow the wrong side, and queen h4 is very strong, followed by rook c1. But Xiong played queen f5. So the knight had to be protected. This slows down white to some extent. Nevertheless, the queen bounced out and can perhaps play queen b4 check, so watch out for the d pawn. That was protected and allows the king to slip away. But in the meantime, white has taken the c file. I mean, if one wanted to be absolutely loopy, it's possible to take that a pawn. But Rapport preferred to play rook c4. This is a very interesting move. He's looking to take complete control of the c file. So obviously he wants to double here. And he tempts the move b5, which, given that b6 was vulnerable, then looks normal. But this is very clever, because now white can actually use this pawn as a slight weakness, because the c5 square has been weakened. But also, after this exchange, then white is ready to play a4 and perhaps bring the rook into the game like that. And you can see the c5 square has been weakened. So it's a little finesse playing rook c4 first, but you know, it can make all the difference to the position. So here's how the game went. Now, after h3, there's actually a threat to exchange all the pieces here and take on e5. The point of playing h3 was to give the king a little escape square, so very normal. So basically, in order to keep that pawn on e5, black had to exchange. And the king finally finds some safety on g7. So the position is kind of stabilizing to some extent. Black still has 3 pawns for the knight blockading beautifully. It's an absolutely mad situation. Rook c7, good move, tying black to the defense of f7. Rook e8 supports the e-pawn, and now queen d5 moves in. Rook e6, good move. Excuse me. So the rook is protecting and blocking, but it can also be active. This is a really critical position, and this came at a time, this is the 34th move, where both players were running very short of time, and one needs time in this situation. Here, I mean, it's very difficult for white to make immediate progress. My computer, excuse me, my computer suggests the move h4, which is certainly not a very human move. And the idea is simply to take away the g5 square from the queen. Queen e4 is very interesting, just to play for an endgame. Now, you might think that with these pawns here, these extraordinary pawns, that this would be very risky for white. But if the king is able to move up the board, to f3, then with the knight on d3, white has great security here. Let me just show you one absolutely fascinating variation. Obviously, it's a good idea for black to get rid of that pawn. And this looks terrifying, but white can sort of control the situation. And now I think this position is basically equal, because the rook can't move away from protecting the e-pawn. Obviously that would be checkmate. But white also can't do anything here, and I think basically they would reach a standstill in this position. The rook shouldn't take here, because that would give the rook freedom to move into the attack. I think that would be very dangerous. So yeah, I think that would just be a draw. But I think very understandably, Richard Rapport thought, well, it's a pawn. Fantastic. Obviously there's a pin. The pawn can't take the knight. In fact, it is possible to take that and play like this. And in this situation, yeah, black is almost getting through. In fact, this will end up in a draw after this. The king can't go up the board. It gets something nasty happens, and that would be a draw. So that's possible. But instead, again, short of time, I mean, impossible to calculate those variations accurately. But Xiong played rook f6, and this is a really clever move, very clever indeed. So first of all, the rook was attacked. It has to move. f7 is nicely protected, and that means that white cannot return to that beautiful blockading square, because that can simply be taken. There's no queen takes rook in the position. So the knight is attacked and has to compromise. It has to go back to an inferior square, and now this is a possibility. So those pawns steaming down the board, and now Rapport, short of time, makes a mistake. He should have played knight g3, and this is still a pretty mad position. Knight e4, I'm afraid, just is bad for white. So white would have to give back the piece. But even here, black has some initiative. But knight c3 is a clear mistake. And this is a really very important move, and I thought this was brilliant from Jeffrey here. He could push with e2, but actually the king can cover with king f2. Rook g6 just adds extra pressure to white's position, and Rapport cracks. The basic idea is that if, well, let's say a3, here, let me show you the threat, e2, and after king f2, then we have rook g2 deflecting the king. So that's why rook g6 was such an important move. It's very cool to actually, hang back from pushing those pawns. And Rapport played rook e7, then b4. That pushes the knight to a very uncomfortable square. e2, well, here it's basically gone. Rapport took on e5, and the rook switched. That was the one move after the time control, so the dust has settled, and here Rapport resigned. Why did he resign? Well, if, let's say, king f2, rook c1 comes anyway, we hit the knight. It can't move because of rook f1 check. So the best that white has is to give up the rook, but this is fairly easy win for the rook against the knight. Well, that was an extraordinary game, and Rapport played so ambitiously in the opening with this pawn sacrifice, and I think it looked very attractive. And it's funny how somehow playing in such an unusual way, it really upsets the opponent. So Jeffrey certainly didn't react in the best way, and he played some odd moves. I mean, I'm not, this piece sacrifice certainly wasn't necessary for black to play, and Xiong was probably worse afterwards, but he held his nerve at the critical moment in those moves around about 35 to 40 and outplayed his esteemed opponent. So that means that Jeffrey Xiong is now at the top of the table along with 3 other players. There are 3 players on 4.5 out of 5. So the pairings, top pairings for the 6th round, Jeffrey Xiong plays Wang Hao, and Hikaru Nakamura on 4 points plays Abhijit Gupta on 4.5. There's another player on 4.5, and that is Arkady Naiditch, but he is taking a bye today. Very interesting strategy. Do subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. Click on the button up there, and you can always support us if you'd like to. Check out patreon.com PowerPlayChess and check out the rewards there, and do have a look at the tournament playlist. There are some fabulous games that we've looked at already. Thanks for watching.